Hello all, and welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. So if you followed my main channel before moving my smoking content to this new one, you may remember a video where I explained my personal rating system. Well, rather than upload that old dated video to the new channel, I figured I'd make a new updated version for our new home on the Cigar Lounge. So I hear it all the time. Do you rate every cigar you smoke? What's the point of rating them? And there's already ratings on them. Why are you doing it? Well, to answer the first question, yes. Unless it's one I've rated before, I typically rate every cigar I smoke. Now, if you're new to cigars, you may not understand why we rate them. Cigars are not like cigarettes, as you're not smoking them for the nicotine. Instead, cigars are an experience. To sit down for an hour and enjoy the flavors and fellowship with other cigar smokers, or in your fortress of solitude. And all cigars are different. Different tobacco blends, different manufacturers, different shapes, all combining their forces to make a unique smoking experience. And with that, everyone's palate is completely different, meaning some cigars are just going to taste better to me than they do to you, and vice versa. So what one of these so-called voices of the cigar world may decide is the end-all be-all rating of a cigar may not align with my or your personal preferences. Now, arguably the most influential cigar rating entity would have to be Cigar Aficionado. For years now, they've printed their top 25 cigars of the year, and while some of their number ones are among my favorites, such as 2020's EP Carrillo Pledge Prequel and 2014's Oliva Serie V Melanio Figurado, others like 2019's Aging Room Quattro I thought tasted like a corroded battery. So that's why I wanted to start rating all my cigars. But since many of these more popular rating entities keep their rating system secret, it drove me to create my own system. So how does my system differ from others? Well, in many ways I took inspiration from other cigar-related YouTubers like Tim from Cigars Daily and formerly TNT Cigars, the channel that actually inspired me to start reviewing cigars in the first place. But even the vast majority of those rating systems didn't quite line up to the way I view cigars. So let's take a look at how I rate cigars, and maybe this system will work for you too. So this is my rating card. Now the first section you see up top here is pretty self-explanatory. This is just your cigar ID portion, which is just the manufacturer, brand/line, wrapper type, and filler. This is just so you know your cigar inside and out, and also helps you down the road to really take note of particular blends and manufacturers you're partial to. Now all of this information is typically readily available online, but if you are an Android user, there's a little app called Cigar Scanner that actually allows you to scan your cigar's barcode or take a picture, and it gives you all the information you could need on most cigars. I actually had a video about this on my main channel as well, but I'll be making another one soon for here. And of course, the date here at the top is really just for organization purposes. Now over here is where we'll place our band, just so we can easily identify our cigars as we're flipping through our journal, without having to search page by page for a certain cigar name. The next line is just a few extra details: your length, ring gauge, and shape. Again, most all of these details are found online, or even your cigar's barcode label. Next up are some personal details about your smoking experience. The first being the type of cut you implement. While it's all personal preference, and no one cut is better than the other, this can still have an impact on your smoking experience. So I always suggest, if you have a bad rating on a cigar due to excessive tar buildup on a punch, an overly tight draw on a straight cut, or an unraveled V-cut, maybe try it again with a different cut. Next is the first of a few controversial points on the card, that being the cost. Now, many of the big rating systems are on a blind taste to cut out any brand biases or preconceived opinions due to blender cost. And while it would certainly be nice to not have to worry about the cost, these things can get expensive, and I do take the cost into consideration on these. Then we have our personal aging time, which is simply how long we've let it rest in our humidor. If I'm not smoking one directly from a store's humidor at their lounge, I'll typically age mine a minimum of 3 months, just by personal preference. And again, if I've got a less than stellar rating from one I've only let age a few months, if I have another, I'll rate it again after about a year or so. Then we have our shop name and smoking location. The shop name is just so we know where we bought it and can go back and get it again, or maybe even avoid if we're getting some outrageously overpriced cigars. And the smoking location just helps us understand our conditions of that day. Maybe we had a bad burn, but notice we were smoking at the park. It may have been a damp, windy day, so that could have had an impact, and maybe this cigar needs another chance. Now we get into our ratings. So the first section is our pre-smoke rating. These are just the factors that have already been attributed to the cigar before smoking. The first category is another controversial one, and that's the band. Now, many people ask why I would include such a thing in my rating when it has nothing to do with the smoking experience. While that is true, it does contribute to the overall experience. I believe presentation is incredibly important to a product. I think of it as an album cover. Years ago, you'd go into a record store and see hundreds of unique works of art designed to entice new and existing fans to buy a band's album. Especially in the rock and metal world, album art was almost as important as the music within, because that was your first impression of the band. They had to sell you on this album before you could listen to it. So in the same vein, I think a cigar's band is just as important. I want to know that a manufacturer is putting forth that extra effort to draw me in. And while I know there are plenty of cigars out there with minimal or no bands at all, yet are still incredible smokes, I only count 5 points for this category. So, just an example, a band such as these three have would easily score a 5. They have an absolutely beautiful design, texture, and are made from a high-quality paper. This thing just screams, "Smoke me." Now, these would most likely bring a 4. While maybe not as detailed of a design, its beauty is in its simplicity and elegance. It just looks sophisticated without trying to be overly flashy. An example of a 3 would be this Don Diego or LFD. It still makes some kind of statement, but is just lacking in any extra detail or quality. Usually a cheaper type of paper with just not much really going on. Now this JR's Oliva is honestly a perfect example of a 2. Really just the bare minimum as far as bands go. Typically just a logo on some gloss paper. Now obviously this has nothing to do with the cigar's overall quality. As I said, this is just judging the extra mile that manufacturers may go to for the presentation of their product. So as long as you have a band, you're still getting a 2. And if your cigar has no band whatsoever like this, that's going to get a 1. The band is on a 1 to 5 scale and no zeros can be given in any category, so even if your cigar is perfect in every other category yet has no band, the worst it can still do is a 96. Next up, we have the appearance. This one is pretty straightforward, just a point off for any nicks, holes, or overly protruding veins in the cigar before a light up. In all my ratings, I don't think I've ever given less than a 7 in this category. Most are perfect 10s or a 9 for excessive veins or a nick at the foot. And last for this section is the price. Now this is another controversial one, as I stated earlier when writing the cost. And even though this is in the pre-smoke section, this will actually not be rated until the end, because you can have a $7 cigar that blows your mind and will get a 10 for the category, or a $20 cigar that smokes like a bundle stick. I know some people don't like that I factor in the price, but I'm sorry. If I'm smoking a $20 cigar, it better smoke like one, and sadly, most don't. I've had some incredible Davidoffs, and my #1 cigar of last year was a near $30 smoke. But all too often, if I've smoked an over $20+ cigar, I'm highly disappointed. And now we move on to the build and smoke section of our ratings. This section is pretty self-explanatory too, and first we have our draw. Now this one is completely based on your personal preference. If you like your draw to be like air through a stovepipe, then judge it by that. If you like it to be as tight as, to steal a line from Full Metal Jacket, sucking a golf ball through a garden hose, then base it off that. I personally like mine to be like sipping a thin milkshake through a straw, a good flow with some resistance. Next up is the burn. Now with this one, I typically allow 1 grace point. If it goes out once or maybe needs a touch up early on, I'll forgive that point, because lots of times it's from a personal error. A bad light, maybe an improper toast, or like I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's just the conditions you're smoking in. But other than that, I'll knock an additional point for every relight or uneven burn. The next category goes hand in hand with the draw and burn, and that's construction. If at any point my cigar starts unraveling after a proper cut, or tunneling after a proper light, the points start dropping. Also, if there's a plug or just overall loose construction of the filler, that'll lose some points as well. But what's really going to aid in points is your ash. If I'm smoking this cigar well into the second or final third and it hasn't dropped its ash, it's probably getting a perfect 10 for construction. And then we have our smoke output. Now, this may be a little difficult to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, but I can usually break this down in 2-point increments, and it's very self-explanatory as well. The more smoke, the higher score. If you're new to cigars, you may not have a strong reference point, but if you're blowing out a cloud, that's a 10. If it looks like your breath on a slightly cool day, that's going to be toward the bottom end. Finally, that brings us to the flavor/enjoyment section. But first, we're going to flip over to the back of this. Here, you'll see space for all the tasting notes. While sometimes I get a bit lazy with this section, I try to be as detailed as possible. Talk about the entire experience, the aroma, the flavors, how it's burning, how strong it is, and break it down into thirds so you can have a complete breakdown of the cigar from light up to finish. All of these notes are what's going to help you rate your final section. So first we have the strength of the cigar. Now this one is also based solely on your preference. If you like a knockdown, drag out smoke, then you rate accordingly. If you like the smoothest of mild smokes, judge it by that. I'm personally a medium to medium full strength kind of guy. I like a little bit of punch, but not enough that it's going to make me dizzy or sick. Next is the flavor, which is once again based on personal preference. If all of the tasting notes line up to your personal palate, then that's going to get a perfect 10. I really like a chocolatey, creamy cigar with notes of coffee, wood, and the slightest bit of spice on the finish. Now that's my overall preference, but I do enjoy a good Connecticut every now and then, and those chocolate and coffee notes aren't typically associated with Connecticut shade wrappers. Does that mean I'm knocking them down to a 4 or 5 automatically? Of course not. The hay and cedar of most Connecticut's may not be my favorite flavors on a cigar, but I still thoroughly enjoy them, and I know that's what I'm getting into when smoking a Connecticut. I may knock off a point or two if it's just not hitting on any of those flavors I like, but the only times I'm really knocking points off is if it's just really only the flavors I can't stand. Really bitter, overly earthy pepper bombs, they're gonna hit near bottom. Next up is body. Now, technically I should have labeled this as complexity, as body is actually something different, but I've got about 500 of these things printed, so I'm not changing it anytime soon. But as I said, this is really about the complexity of the cigar. A good rule of thumb I use is I look back at my notes and count how many flavors and tasting notes I've listed. If it's 10 or more, I give that a perfect 10. Any less, I start matching point for each tasting note, because even if I'm just tasting bland smoke, that's at least one flavor. And lastly, that brings us to the amount smoked. Besides the band, this is the only other category that's worth only 5 points. And I also allow this one some leeway. If I'm smoking an incredible cigar, but it's just such a slow burner, and I really have to get going, if I would have finished it under normal circumstances, I still give it a 5. If I'm halfway through one and just can't stand the thing another second, that's when I drop it to a 3. I've only had a couple premium cigars that I just couldn't stand after the first few draws, but in all my ratings, I've never given a cigar less than a 4, because I'm just that willing to give every cigar the chance it deserves. Now, before I add up my total score, this is the time I go back to my price category and determine its rating there. And I also want to add my smoking time, the time it took me to smoke the cigar, and what I paired the cigar with. Sometimes a cigar may only be as good as what it's paired with. The right drink or food item can really make the cigar, just as the wrong item can ruin the entire experience. If you've got a low score for taste and body, maybe try the cigar again with a different pairing. But if it was perfect, then you know to keep the combination for next time. Then finally, we just add up all of our points for one final score, and this is our cigar's rating. And if you want to give them a letter grade, I typically just base it off a 10-point scale. Anything in the 90s to 100 is an A, 80's a B, and so on. And by that logic, I've never rated anything less than a mid-C to my remembering. So that's my rating system. As you can see, my system is not a one-size-fits-all rating. A cigar that gets a 90 for me may only be a 75 for you and vice versa. But my system is designed to give your cigars a rating custom tailored to the individual, because no one but you is going to know what you'll like in a cigar. And if you're sitting there wondering how you would ever be able to remember certain details like where and when you bought your cigars, here's a little bonus for you. You can make an index like this in Excel that lists the cigar, purchase date, shop, and the price. Now, I've been a little neglectful to use this, but I really should start back. It would really help come rating time. But I hope you've enjoyed this deeper look into my rating system, and feel free to use it yourself. You can print you a stack of these, throw them in a binder, then you'll have your own cigar journal. If you like this type of content or cigar content in general, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new upload. Thank you all for watching and joining me here on the Cigar Lounge. I'm Vincent Rains, and I'll see you all next time. Stay smoky, my friends.